Before we dismiss the kids to Children's Church, I want them to get to celebrate with us real quick. We do have a new person joining our church family this morning, Sean Donaldson, sitting right over there. He's been with us for about 3 months now or so. He's our brand newest member. Let's welcome him. I've gotten to know Sean. I'm getting to know Sean. He's a great guy, and I very much encourage you. Come meet him. He's super friendly. You'll talk for an hour, but he's a good guy. All right, let's dismiss the kids to Children's Church. They can head out, and while they head out, Reese, if you'll help me real quick. This is going to freak everybody out. Now, you may not have seen one of these in a while. This is a podium. Much like our songbooks, we don't use them too often anymore, but occasionally they're needed. Before we jump into the text this morning, a couple other things that are cool that are happening. This morning, Tom Williams posted in our Facebook group and asked me to share this with you, that World Bible School is looking for people who would like to help. This week, they had the headquarters of World Bible School reached out to us and said that if we were ready, they had new people waiting. And of course, Tom's answer to that is always yes. So they have 2,210 new World Bible students from Nigeria who are wanting to study the Bible, which is a wonderful thing. So if you're looking for a way to serve this summer and you got some extra time, you'd be willing to help grade or sort or do all the different things that World Bible School does, Tom would be happy to train you and get you involved. So 2 ways you can respond if you're in our Facebook group, which is kind of a members-only deal because where we share private kind of family stuff and prayer requests. You can respond there, or even if you're a guest with us, you can still serve in this way. You can respond to Tom at this email address. I'll leave it up there for just a second. Another cool thing, a win that happened this week, is that we did host the Wilson graduation. And I didn't just want you to hear about it, I wanted to let you see it. This was this room on Thursday. Thursday morning, we had 350 people in here, celebrating these 72 fifth graders that walked across the stage. It was absolutely packed in here, and then after it was over, we had a reception for them outside, and that foyer out there, I thought, we should probably be in 2 places because there's no way 350 people will fit in this one foyer, and 350 people said, bet. It was a little tight, but it was wonderful. And I don't just show you that because I want you to know that everybody was here. I show you that because our church's mission is to connect kids and their families to Jesus and his church. And we've been focused on Wilson this year specifically. And at times, it's a fair question to say, yeah, but what results have we seen? And I explained a couple months ago now about the way of St. Patrick and his style of evangelism, of building relationships and of being very strategic, and we've been doing that. But you need to hear this story, because Stacy, the principal of Wilson, came up to me and Ryan as we were holding the doors and welcoming everybody in. She said, I got to tell you this story. See, Wilson Elementary this year has been an overflow school, which means that as Ranch Heights and Wayside Elementary have filled up, anybody extra has been overflowing, and Wilson has been one of the schools that's picked those kids up. Well, next year, the kids whose families moved into those districts are supposed to be at those schools. So they had a family from Wayside, or who are zoned for Wayside, who have been at Wilson, who submitted a transfer request this year saying, hey, we really want to stay at Wilson. And in that interview process to find out why the kids should stay at Wilson, the number one reason they put for wanting to stay at Wilson Elementary was the Adams Boulevard Church of Christ. They said, we've never been anywhere where a group of people not from the school loved our kids the way that this church has shown up and loved our kids all year. And we want to stay here so we can be a part of that. That is what happens when the church shows up consistently to honor God and connect kids and their families to Jesus and his church. I don't know what comes next from all this. If you're like, well, where are all the people? Well, 350 of them were right here on Thursday. As they were filing in, I looked at Ryan and I said, in faith, someday this is what it's going to feel like on a Sunday morning. We're not there yet, but we're marching. Okay. Enough pretext. Let's say our memory verse together, shall we? You can look at the screen and say it with me if you like, and then hopefully we're getting this burned into our brains. Here we go. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Let's say it again. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. One last time, try not to look at the screen. Here we go. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. That's the word of Jesus from Matthew chapter 16. A couple of weeks ago, as you may have seen on Facebook, Lauren and I took a couple of weeks and we got out of town. Not to Dewey. Not even to Florida, which we love. We crossed the pond, if you will. We spent a couple of weeks in Switzerland. And the reason we went to Switzerland is that my sister and brother-in-law were celebrating their 10th anniversary. And they said, hey, we're going to rent a house, and if you can get here, you can stay with us for free. And we said, there's never been a better deal offered in the history of humanity than that. We'll get there. And so we went and enjoyed Switzerland for 2 weeks. And because it was an anniversary celebration for Leah and Jeff, they asked, we were going to have a special dinner one night to celebrate the anniversary. And about 5 minutes before we left the house, they go, oh, we forgot. Would you mind doing a blessing while we're at dinner? Now, asking the preacher to talk off the cuff is a dangerous thing. But I did their wedding, actually, a decade ago. And they said, you've married us, you know us. Would you speak some words of wisdom, some words of blessing over us? So we ate dinner, and when the time came, I looked at them. And I began to talk about their love. And I began to talk about what it was like a decade ago when they were getting to know one another and when they were falling in love and when they were making these vows to one another a decade ago, all the plans and dreams they had. And in that decade, they bought a house and sold a house and built a house and moved again and they got pregnant and had twins, haha. And then they had another kid, and so their family has grown from 2 to 5, and they've started businesses and sold businesses, and it's just all of life has happened in a decade. And as I'm talking about this story, they hold hands. They look at each other, doughy-eyed. Someone at the table wipes a tear. And I say, so what comes next for the next 10 years? That first decade is all about building. And the second decade is all about maintenance. And the mood changed. Maintenance isn't nearly so sexy, is it? But the first decade is about having your kids, and the next decade is all about making sure you get them out of the house. The first decade is all about falling in love, and the next decade is all about remembering eventually we should probably have a date. The first decade is spontaneous. The second decade, you plan sex on the calendar. It just gets different in the second decade. It's maintenance. It goes from fun. Sometimes it becomes work. I didn't even talk about the third decade where you just learn to tolerate each other. I'm sure that isn't true. I've heard wonderful things about the third decade. I really did talk about maintaining, and the mood really did kind of take a hit. But there are some truths about love and marriage that just aren't always easy to hear, aren't there? There's a reason that most romance movies end with a big kiss at the end. They crescendo right before things get real. Before the infatuation of young love gives way to the daily grind of sharing life together. That, of course, is where real love is made or broken. But it's not nearly so glamorous. Love is fun to fall into, but maintaining love requires dedicated work. When we were doing our premarital counseling, our counselor told us that there are some common times when marriage gives way to divorce. Like year 7, you know what that's called, the 7-year itch. It's a thing. Also year 11, year 16, year 20. These are all places where divorce peaks, where life changes happen. He didn't bother to mention the hardest year of all, year 1. Oh my goodness, it's a miracle Lauren and I are still married, that we made it past those first 9 months. We lived in the middle of nowhere. Arkansas, far away from our families. We had to figure out how to mesh our two lives together in this tiny little town with nothing to distract us from just how hard it was to live together. I was this immature college kid. Yes, I know the house needs work. I told you I'd do it. You don't have to nag me every 3 months. I was finishing up my degree, which gave me a lot of time at home because Lauren was working full time, and it turns out she wasn't real happy when she came home and I was playing video games. Plus, then birth control just wreaked havoc. Some of you know what I'm talking about. And Lauren became this crazy person, and neither one of us had any idea why. And so we were both looking at each other like we don't even know each other anymore. Then throw on top of that the complete inability and no knowledge of how to manage money. And it is a miracle we survived the first 9 months. Oh, by the way, don't forget Presley and David get married in 2 weeks. Really happy for you guys. Just congratulations. It's great. It really is a miracle that anybody's marriage makes it any distance at all, because it takes so much work over the years. It requires a constant checkup and maintenance to keep us on track. Just the other day, I was once again feeling uneasy, like I needed to just kind of check on us, you know? We just celebrated 10 years. We're at like 17, and just how are we doing? And so I took Lauren out to dinner so that we could spend a little time and just kind of check up. And while we're eating, I asked, Lauren, will you love me when I'm old and unattractive? And without hesitation, she said, yes, of course I do. And I felt so much better. Marriage is hard, and it's wonderful. It's work, and it's fun, and it's draining, and it's fulfilling, and it's holy, and it's messy. And Jesus has something important to teach us about marriage this morning. But I won't pretend that it's easy. Look at Matthew chapter 19. Page 788 in these Bibles that we share. When Jesus had finished saying these things about correcting another believer and forgiving over and over and over again, like a grateful debtor. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went down to the region of Judea, east of the Jordan River. Large crowds followed him there, and he healed their sick. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus said. They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Well, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? They asked. And Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts. But it was not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. Jesus' disciples then said to him, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. Not everyone can accept this statement, Jesus said. Only those whom God helps. Some are born as eunuchs, and some are made eunuchs by others, and some choose not to marry, or some become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. The reason I have a podium this morning is so I have something to hide behind. Now, the reason I have a podium this morning is because there are some topics that you know are sensitive going in. There are some topics that are better not to be, at least partially off the cuff. This is one of them. This is a sensitive passage, a difficult passage, a passage that has at times been completely ignored, at times been used to hurt people. It has been weaponized by some spouses as they mistreated another. It has been mistreated by ministers to lock people in situations that have been hurtful or harmful. And yet we can't deny the fact that Jesus brings this up not only once but twice in the Gospel of Matthew. That is something that he cares to talk about. And so I want to take it seriously. It's sensitive for Jesus as well, by the way. Jesus knows what it is to be a child in a marriage that has questionable origins, whose parentage is unsure or unknown. He knows what it is to have rumors fly around about your parents. And not only that, but Jesus is, as the scripture tells us here, on the east side of the Jordan River once again. He's been kind of bouncing around this area of northern Judea, but now he is on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which puts him squarely back in Herod's territory when these people ask this question. Jesus, should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for any reason? And those of you who remember back to Matthew chapter 14, remember that there was a guy named John who once talked about divorce and remarriage, and what happened to him? It's not good. So Jesus is in a sensitive place when he's being asked about this. And I have wrestled with this text. I want you to know I've agonized over this sermon because I've listened and studied to a lot of other preachers, and the way that I was hearing them talk about it just didn't make any sense to me most of the time, frankly. Which means two things. Number one, it means that I cannot in good conscience ignore or dismiss what Jesus says. And it also means, number two, that the way that I've heard some preachers use this thing has led to situations that just seem on their face horrific. I've heard of people who heard sermons about this passage and said, I must stay in an abusive relationship. I've heard people who have heard sermons on this who then said, it occurs to me now that I'm going to be celibate for the rest of my life. Which may or may not be the worst thing in the world, but it also means I'm largely going to be lonely. Perhaps one of the worst things I saw was someone who listened to a preacher's sermon on this passage and then said, after listening to this, my spouse and I realized, we were both divorced and remarried, that we needed to divorce and live separately, and we have 2 children. None of that works for me. But I'm not really the point, am I? What works for me isn't really the question, because I'm not the king here. I'm not the one that needs to be listened to. We are here to sit at the feet of King Jesus. But when one passage can lead to that many different responses, I began to think that maybe we were missing something. So I have a podium this morning because we got to do a deep dive. I thought maybe I could get away with skimming through this. It doesn't work that way. With this passage, you have to understand what Jesus is talking about, because it turns out the context and history that Jesus is living inside of makes a lot of difference for the way you understand this passage. So whatever your preconceived notion of this might be, let's show one another the grace, and I hope you'll show me the grace, of moving through this a little bit slowly this morning, that we might have a more full understanding of what Jesus is doing with this sensitive topic. In Jesus' time, there's 2 passages from the Old Testament that are referred to over and over again by the rabbis, by the legal scholars, because marriage is a legal institution. For all of our talk about marriage being instituted by God, and that some people I even know have gotten married in front of God but not the state because of Social Security or something. The Bible has a term for people who are married in front of God and not the state. Do you know what they call that? The word for that is concubine. Marriage in the Old Testament is always a legal institution as well as a spiritual one. And so the rabbis, the legal scholars of their time, they use 2 primary passages when they talk about marriage, divorce, and the expectation of the 2. The first one comes from Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, where it says, if a man who has married a slave wife takes for himself another wife, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife, the slave wife, to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these 3 obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. Now, that's a weird passage to talk about, isn't it, in the 21st century? But it's important because the rabbis correctly looked at this and said, if Moses went out of his way to give marriage rights to a slave wife, the person with the least rights in society, then this should be the bare minimum of what is expected between spouses, no matter who the spouse is. And so from this they said there are 3 things at least that husbands and wives are expected to give each other: food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. When we were in Switzerland, Lauren looked at me one day. We'd been hanging out for a while, and she's like, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. And at one point, she looks at me and she says, you know the Torah says that if you don't feed me, I can divorce you. We got dinner. And then the passage that has to do with divorce is a bit longer. This is from Deuteronomy 24. This is the one that Jesus cites in this conversation. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. These are the two passages that the rabbis, the legal scholars, regularly wrestle with to decide whether or not a couple can divorce. And that is the question. When you wanted a divorce, you would go to the rabbis, you would go to these religious scholars, and you would ask them. In fact, what would happen is that the husband and the wife would both get a rabbi. And then there would have to be a third, and you better choose that third wisely. Because by Jesus' time, all the rabbis agreed that spouses were expected to give one another their rights: food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. And there were elaborate marriage contracts defining just how much food, just how much clothing, just how much sex, what the division of labor was, that were all signed during the negotiation before two people were married. We still have some of those contracts today. Archaeologists have found them in the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scroll area. So we can see how much thought went in on the front end to make sure that these three things were well spelled out so that people would know what was expected of them. All the rabbis agreed that this was an expectation, and if these things were not taken care of, it was considered abandonment, and either spouse could leave. Now, if any of this wasn't given, the way a divorce would happen is that a husband could give his wife a certificate of a divorce. The Jews call that a get. They could give the wife a get, and they would give it to her and say, I'm divorcing you, get out of the house. And once she leaves the house, the marriage is over. Would it surprise you to learn that women couldn't do it that easily? For women, they had to go and get the rabbis, and they had to explain, here's the way he isn't providing for me. He's not giving me all these things he promised me. And then they would listen to her case, and they could dismiss her. They could allow a divorce. The husband had all the power, but at least in the law, there was an expectation. There was an expectation that he still had to honor her as long as she was honoring her part of the agreement, of the covenant of marriage. Here are the accepted grounds of divorce: infertility, infidelity, which, by the way, adultery was a capital offense, but we don't have any evidence they actually practiced that at the time of Christ. But in both cases, if the couple was infertile or one of them had committed adultery, you were expected to get divorced. Because the primary reason for sex is procreation. If you can't do that, then maybe God isn't blessing you. And infidelity, if one spouse is cheated, then you're expected to divorce them. This is what's going on with the rabbis at the time of Jesus. Food and clothing were merged into one category: material neglect. Conjugal rights were treated separately as emotional neglect, and, for the record, emotional neglect, according to the rabbis, included physical abuse. And if any of that happened, you could receive a divorce. If there was a guilty party, if it was, I'll talk about that in a second. All of this, everything I just told you, is agreed upon by the time Jesus is on the scene. However, in the first century AD, before Jesus was born, there's these two rabbis who come on the scene, and it kind of splits everything. There's a rabbi called Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Shammai is what you might call conservative. He looked at the scripture, he looked at everything I just told you, and he agreed with it. He said that according to, as long as both parties follow the vows of their marital agreement, divorce is not allowed. If the marriage contract was broken, then they must get a divorce. This is all in alignment with the traditional understanding of divorce. But Rabbi Hillel's a clever guy. Rabbi Hillel looks at that passage in Deuteronomy, and he says, Well, let me just go back real quick. He looks at this and he says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if she then finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and the text there says some indecency about a thing. It's really some nakedness about a thing is what we translate indecency. If she has some nakedness about a thing that he doesn't like. And he said, wait, the word is and. Indecent in nakedness and a thing. So, Rabbi Hillel said, if the man marries the wife and she has some sexual indecency or there is anything else he doesn't like about her, he can get rid of her. Just give her the certificate and she has to go. Rabbi Hillel created no-fault divorce. You could dismiss her from any reasons, and we have the rabbis' writings about these things. A whole bunch of rabbis go, brilliant! If she burns the food, get rid of her. Doesn't give you enough sex, get rid of her. Someone's younger, more attractive, get rid of her. And all the men went, brilliant, Hillel, brilliant. And so by the time of Jesus, no-fault divorce was everywhere. So much so, this was adopted so quickly that we see a legal snapback happen, a legal repercussion. This is exactly what you would expect if you're a dad trying to find a suitable partner for your daughter. All of a sudden, it becomes very risky for her to marry anybody, doesn't it? Because he could kick her to the curb. And if he kicks her to the curb for some reasonable fault, she might not even get the dowry back. And so what ends up happening in the legal code at the time of Jesus, this is so rampant that people start doing prenuptial agreements. If you end this marriage in divorce for any reason other than adultery, here are all the things that you have to provide. It then becomes prohibitively expensive for most people to get divorced. And instead of divorce being this covenant and vow made between two people, it's held together by money. Sound like anything else you know? Sound like anywhere else you know? Sound like any other outcome you know? There is nothing new under the sun. So it turns out by the time of Jesus that about the only people who actually are getting divorced regularly under this no-fault divorce system are wealthy people. People like the religious leaders who come and then ask Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? The any reason here is not asking, is there any reason a person ever might get divorced? All the rabbis said, yes, of course there are reasons, according to the Torah, that you might get divorced. These people are asking a specific legal question. Do you see that now? They're asking about actual verbiage and actual legal cases that are going on at the time of Jesus. And they show up and say, which of these is right? Rabbi Shammai or Rabbi Hillel? Which way do you think the law is supposed to swing? And in Jesus' response, he sides with Rabbi Shammai. And then he goes a step further. That's what Jesus always does. Look back at the text in Matthew 19. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he said, haven't you read the scriptures? Like, don't you know your Old Testament? They've already worked this out. You can't just get divorced for any reason. There are some reasons that are given and everything else is no. They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. Oh, he's going back beyond the law now. He's going back to the creation story. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no man split apart what God has joined together. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. So in Matthew 19, they're asking, is no-fault divorce legal according to the Torah? Jesus responds with Rabbi Shammai and then takes it an extra step farther by saying that if you get divorced, you're committing adultery if you remarry. Okay, hold on. Because to understand how he takes that extra step, we got to understand one other thing that's buried here in the text. If you want to underline something this morning, here you go. Underline the phrase hardness of heart. Hardness of heart means stubborn, but it comes with a lot of theological context. Hardness of heart is a Greek phrase that means stubborn. It pulls from a Hebrew phrase, and it's only found one time in the Old Testament in any conversation about divorce. That's from Jeremiah 4:4. And the word hardness of heart in Jeremiah 4:4 is actually talking about God divorcing Israel and Judah. See, Israel and Judah, according to the prophet Jeremiah, have been adulterating, they've been prostituting themselves with other gods instead of just Yahweh. And because they've been committing adultery, God has warned them over and over again, tried to win them back over and over again. And finally, he said to Israel, "You're done," and the Assyrian army comes and takes them away, never to return. And now the prophet Jeremiah is warning the country of Judah that if you don't repent, the same thing will happen to you. This hardness of heart comes in the context of adultery in the Old Testament, and it has to do with spiritual idolatry. The spiritual adultery is part of why God has rejected and divorced Israel and is going to do the same for Judah. So in Jesus' time, adultery is one of the things that the religious leaders are severely worried about. They police it all over the place. This is why they will drag a woman in John chapter 8 in front of Jesus, caught in adultery. They police it because they believe that the ticket out of exile, one of the sins that landed them in exile, is the sin of adultery. So now Jesus has said that if you're dismissing your wife like this, and then just so you can marry someone else, that is adultery. And that will pollute the land. That will bring punishment by God. When they ask Jesus about divorce, these Pharisees, he tells them with this language that their hearts are still hard. They're no different from the people of Judah to whom Jeremiah prophesied. And that by rejecting their spouse for any old reason, they are committing adultery when they remarry her when she does. This has dire context, or dire consequences in the context of Jeremiah. However, in this passage, Jesus is also telling us that when a spouse is hard-hearted or unrepentant in their adultery, just like God did at some point, you let them go. But Jesus also says, just like God, you don't have to. This is radical. Every rabbi in the crowd assumed that if adultery took place, if some kind of sexual sin happened, you had to divorce that person. And Jesus is saying that's not actually the case. One more interesting note. Let's talk about sexual sin. When Jesus uses the word sexual sin here in Matthew chapter 19, it's not the word for adultery. It's the word porneia, from which we gather the word pornography. It is any sexual sin. So there's a play on words happening here. I know this is a lot of context, guys, but I promise without this, the rest of it doesn't make any sense. With porneia, when Jesus says that, the Pharisees come and say, "Can you divorce your wife for any old reason?" And Jesus says, "For any sexual immorality." That's the any. If you're looking for an out, that's the one you get when it comes to any. It's any sexual sin, not just adultery. It's important to note that when the Pharisees come to ask Jesus about the legality of divorce, Jesus actually wants to talk about the importance of marriage. Did you notice that? It's helpful because the way of Jesus isn't the way of not sinning. The lifestyle of Jesus is not the lifestyle that is empty of sin. The lifestyle of Jesus is the lifestyle that is filled up with righteousness. I feel like that needs an amen. I know I just changed gears on you, but don't let me lose you. The lifestyle of Jesus is not the life that is empty of sin. The lifestyle of Jesus is the life that is so full of righteousness, there's no room for anything else. That's what Jesus is going to call these people to. They want to know about divorce, and he says, let's talk about marriage instead. Marriage, he says, was created by God to be a blessing to both husband and wife. The passage he quotes from Genesis chapter 2. It's a two-part story, Genesis 1 and 2. There's creation of male and female. And the pinnacle of the creation story is not when man is created or when woman is created. The pinnacle of Genesis chapter 2 is when man and woman who are separate come together to become one. It's when they are reunited that there is this moment in the creation story. Jesus says this is the moment. You're looking for ways to get out of this thing that is supposed to be holy. You've missed the whole point. This harmony is a peace between husbands and wives that the Bible calls righteousness, right relationship. And I want you to notice that when the Pharisees asked Jesus this question about divorce for any old reason, they're not at all concerned with righteousness. They're actually stripping women of their dignity. The very question of asking if a man can divorce his wife for just any reason assumes that he will be treating her in an unrighteous way. In this question, the Pharisees are dehumanizing these women. Do you see that? They aren't concerned with the well-being of their wives, nor are they treating women as equal creations of God. The question the Pharisees are actually asking is, how can I get what I want from another person as long as I want, and then get rid of her as easily as possible whenever I want? The well-being of their wives never entered the question. All they care about is what they want and what they can get, and that is fundamentally unrighteous. When you come to the place where you no longer care about your spouse's well-being and only worry about your own interests, you are no longer in the realm of righteousness and love. This is now the realm of lust and abuse. I'm going to say that again. When you come to the place where you no longer care about your spouse's well-being and only worry about your own interests, you're no longer in the realm of righteousness and love. This is the realm of lust and abuse. Lust is not sexual attraction. Lust dehumanizes the other person and wants them for what they can do for you instead of who they are. Abuse takes whatever a person wants and gives nothing in return. These men are now treating their women as less than human, and Jesus is totally against that. Anything that removes the dignity of another human being is inherently unrighteous and violates the way of Jesus. And so Jesus is trying to correct them and remind us of the imperative that men and women are equal, both created in the image of God, and that marriage is supposed to be a blessing to all involved. That's the emphasis Jesus puts in this passage. I want to summarize all this before we move into application, because I know we've covered a lot of territory. I can see it in your face. Vered Hillel does a good job of summarizing how Jesus interacts with his culture and background in this passage. Here's what he says. In Matthew 19:10, the disciples are astonished at Jesus' teaching. On one hand, he made divorce much more difficult than the norm of his day. He taught that marriage was monogamous and intended to be inseparable from the beginning. The breakup of a marriage was sin with serious consequences because God witnessed the couple's marriage vows and joined them together. He repudiated Rabbi Hillel's any matter or no fault divorce and advocated divorce only if the erring partner continued in his or her sinful ways hard-heartedly. On the other hand, he taught that divorce was not compulsory in cases of adultery, nor was marriage required. In response to the disciple statement, Jesus puts forth eunuchs as an example of those who don't marry. They are eunuchs by birth, by force, and for the kingdom of heaven. So what do we do with all this? I know it's a lot of background. Let's land the plane. Everything I've relayed so far has been from study of what other people have said on the matter. And there is a lot of it, and I've spent a ridiculous amount of time trying to understand what Jesus is doing here. But here's what I've never heard anybody say. I've never heard anybody talk about what Jesus is doing in this passage within the broader context of Matthew. Isn't it nice to study the whole book at once? Jesus talks about divorce twice, and it's worth paying attention to the context of his teachings. Look at the Sermon on the Mount. You can flip back real quick if you like, all the way back to Matthew chapter 5, which we covered so many weeks ago. But in Matthew chapter 5, before he gets to divorce, Jesus talks about righteousness. He talks about following the law. He talks about anger. He talks about lawsuits. He talks about adultery. Then he talks about divorce. And then he talks about vows, keeping your vows, and about taking revenge, and finally about loving your enemies. Now, if that doesn't sound like a playbook for how a relationship goes, I don't know what is. If you don't treat your spouse well, let me tell you what's in store for you. How about lawsuits and hatred and adultery and divorce and broken vows and revenge and ultimately hating your enemies? And he says, not my people. Look at the immediate context in Matthew chapter 19. Just before this, when Jesus had finished saying these things, what things? The things about correcting a believer who is sinning against you and about forgiving. over and over and over again. And anybody who has been married for more than 3 weeks knows how important this is. We can look at what Jesus is doing here, and we can look at his teaching and say it's all about how we get along, and it is. But the most intimate relationship you have is often also the hardest. It's easy to treat other people you rarely see with forgiveness. It's a lot harder to do it to the person you have to go to bed with tomorrow night, and the night after, and the night after. Do you really have to clink your spoon every time you take a bite? I told you 1,000 times. I'm sorry again. Matthew has been teaching us Jesus followers now for 19 chapters that the way of Jesus is proactive righteousness. After Jesus has talked about all of these things, about correcting a believer and the need to forgive generously. And now when asked about divorce, he talks about the importance and the permanence of marriage. Why? Because divorce is a brutally painful process. Divorce is the ripping apart of people and their lives. And you know what the Bible calls it when you break God's peace between people? The Bible calls that sin. This is not what we were meant to live in. What God has joined together, he says, let no one tear apart. Yeah, that's true of every single one of us. What God has joined, because God has joined us all together in the bonds of Christian family, and sin gets in the middle of that, we see how it wreaks havoc. But in its most intimate destruction, sin tears marriages apart and leaves lives in tatters. So when people come to Jesus asking, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? Jesus, are you cool with no-fault divorce? This is entirely the wrong question. For the Christian, the question should never be, can I get divorced? The question should always be, how do I do everything in my power to treat my spouse in righteous ways? How do I do everything in my power to build and sustain a peaceful relationship rooted in the bonds of love? Sometimes Jesus says the relationship is unable to be saved. Some of you are sitting right now, you've been uncomfortable the whole time because you have been divorced. You are remarried. Jesus says sometimes the marriage relationship is unable to be saved. But if both spouses are Christians committed to the way of Jesus, I cannot imagine a situation in which divorce is the only possible outcome. Divorces don't happen because there is no sin in the relationship. Divorces happen because sin festers in the middle of a relationship and tears it apart from the inside. Oh, this is heavy. I've been asked, is every divorce sin? Remember what sin is. Sin is anything that breaks God's peace between people. After a ton of study, here's what I understand to be true. Not every divorce is sin. Not every divorce is sin. But every divorce involves sin. Every divorce comes about because of sin. And if you've been through that, you know just how painfully true that is. This is not an esoteric or a far out idea. This is the lived reality for so many of us, and you have been brutalized by the sin that got wrapped up in the middle of your marriage. Some of us are still married, and we're still being brutalized by the sin that gets wrapped up in the middle of our marriage. I do not believe that Jesus is disagreeing with the Torah in his teachings about divorce or saying there's never a time. I don't think Jesus is saying there's never a time a Christian can divorce his or her spouse. There is neglect and abuse and sexual sin that happens that rips a marriage apart. And I don't think Jesus is disagreeing with every other rabbi out there. He's taking a stand about no-fault divorce. If your spouse is abandoning you, abusing you, refusing to provide you with food, clothing, safety, refusing to engage in sexual intimacy, assuming they are capable of these things, then these are all grounds that all the rabbis agreed were legal reasons for divorce. Failing to do these things was a breaking of their marriage vows, and so it was sin. If there's been sexual infidelity in the marriage and that spouse is unrepentant, that's also a legitimate reason for divorce according to Jesus. But once again, there is already sin involved, isn't there? Unlike the rabbis of his time, though, Jesus does not demand that you have to get divorced. There is still an opportunity for reconciliation in your marriage, even in the hardest time. And whenever sinful Christians repent of their sins, forgive each other, and reconcile, that is a faithful witness to Jesus and his way of peace. Many of us know people who have been through these hard times and found ways to reconcile, and it is a glorious testimony to Jesus' way. And we also know people who have been so badly sinned against by their spouse that the single best decision they ever made in that relationship was to get out. Outside of those circumstances, though, divorce itself is a sin, is what Jesus says. But even then, it's the result of other sins: selfishness, hatred, anger, slander, etc. If we divorce for any reason, then Jesus says, other than those above, and we remarry, he says, it's adultery. That's a big deal because it's one of the big 10. After a divorce, even after a divorce, though, the hope, Jesus says, or is implying, Paul will say explicitly, is there might be a path to reconciliation and forgiveness. But practically, we know that isn't always possible. And Jesus is practical. If the other spouse remarries, he says that's adultery. And then what happens if one spouse commits adultery? The other is released. When Jesus meets that woman in John chapter 8, the woman at the well, he talks about her story. And he says, bring your husband. And she says, I have no husband. He says, that's right, you've been married how many times? 5. Jesus doesn't say you've been married once and committed adultery with 4 other guys. He says you've been married 5 times. And now this guy you're living with, he's not your husband. He acknowledges that there are legitimate remarriages. We've seen for 5 months now that Jesus is teaching us that we have an individual responsibility to follow his teachings, regardless of what other people do. So however it is in your power to follow Jesus in your marriage, it is your and my responsibility to do so. Say it one more time. In our marriages, as a Jesus follower, however it is in our power to follow Jesus, it is our responsibility individually to do so. It's not our spouse's responsibility to follow Jesus. It's mine. It's yours. And I just said that to everyone here equally. Learning to follow Jesus is learning to follow him everywhere, even in your marriage. Even when they hate you, even when they take you to court, even when they're engaged in a pattern of sexual sin, even when they've broken their vows, even when your spouse has become your enemy, you may not have to stay with them, but you do have to choose to follow the path of love and righteousness as you deal with them. Only one spouse is willing to follow with Jesus, and if you are that spouse, then you are called to be the righteous example of God's love, regardless of what your spouse does. Notice what I said there. I didn't say you must always be stuck in that relationship. I said that you are called to be a righteous example of God's love. I know there's another question floating out there. What if I'm already divorced and remarried? Are my spouse and I committing adultery now? Are we living in sin? Are we lost? If that's your question, I love you so much. You know how hard it is to ask that question honestly? You know how much you have to love Jesus to say, I'm actually really curious to make sure I'm following Jesus, even in this situation where everything is on the line. There's so much love for Jesus in that question. So good news and bad news. Good news first. The good news is, according to the Torah and Jesus' own teaching, at some point, the previous marriage does end and the new one is valid. Hypothetically, if someone was to come and tell me they left their spouse because, I don't know, you fell out of love. Now you're married again. And you realize you're out of step with Jesus in this area. I didn't get divorced for the reasons Jesus said was okay. It was a no-fault divorce. I did it anyway. Now I'm married. Does my marriage need to end? No. Jesus' teaching to married people is what we've been saying. Treat your spouse in righteous ways and stay married if it's within your power to do so. That means love the one you're with the way Jesus would love the one you're with. In fact, I have heard preachers abuse people, in my estimation, by telling them to end the marriage they're in and try to go back to the first spouse, which is a direct violation of the commandment we read in Deuteronomy chapter 24. It's not allowed. So, that's the good news. Yes, your marriage is valid. Love the Lord in your marriage. The bad news is this. For a lot of us, when we did leave our marriages, it ended ugly. It ended in a lot of sin. And it may not have been your fault that the divorce happened, but the way that you interacted with that there was not as a representative of Jesus. And in Matthew 18, before we got to Matthew 19, Jesus tells us how we are to treat those who have sinned against us or whom we have sinned against. And what does he say? Go, confess your sin, and forgive the other person. I would suggest to you, this is the hard part of this teaching this morning. Everything else feels like pretty good news to me, but this one is kind of hard. It's hard to go and talk to your enemy and ask them to forgive you and to confess the sin that you did against them. I would suggest to you that as long as it is not physically dangerous for you to do so, reconciling with your ex-spouse is an example of the love and forgiveness of the way of Jesus. And then you have to do the really hard thing. To treat your current spouse like Jesus would. The ongoing following of Jesus. Okay. Lest we spend all of our time buried under a teaching that's so heavy, let's end the sermon with a laugh. As it so often happens, we get to laugh at the apostles' expense. After Jesus talks about all this weight, and this is all under the surface here, Jesus' disciples then said to him, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. Jesus, if I can't kick her out for any reason ever, whenever I want, it's better never to marry. If that's not the most teenage boy thing you've ever heard anybody say, I don't know what is. I can't get whatever I want whenever I want it. Oh, I'm just going to be single forever. With that attitude, you certainly will. Jesus' response is hysterical. I have to imagine that Jesus, as a 30-year-old dude, is talking to these teenagers with a wry grin on his face when he says the next part. They say, it's better not to marry. And Jesus says, not everyone can accept this statement. Like, oh, you're very wise to have pointed this out, boys. Only those whom God helps. Yes, God's been helping us. You know, some are born eunuchs. Some have been made eunuchs by others. And some choose to become eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Can you imagine telling this to a bunch of teenage boys? You know, if really all you're in marriage for is whatever you can get it, and then you can get out whenever you want. If that's what you want, here's this deal. Sometimes God gives people the gift of castration. And you have to know, at that point, it kind of puts it in perspective, doesn't it? Follow the way of Jesus. Or if this is just too hard for you, I'll give you a second option. And at that point, all the boys are like, you know, faithfulness doesn't seem so bad. We act like Jesus' teaching here is some big, horrible deal. Marriages are hard. They require maintenance. The road gets bumpy. They're work. But you know what's worse than putting off the work of righteousness in a marriage? Not putting in the work of righteousness in a marriage. Being at odds with your spouse and divorce is way harder in the long run. Jesus is giving us a gift here by reminding us that this is meant to be a blessing and that it can be a blessing for your whole life. He's calling us forward to something better, which is what he always does. This is what I didn't tell you. In the Torah, that stuff about slave wives, that was actually a massive leap forward in ethics. At the time, slave wives had no rights. And God, through Moses, tells the Israelites, if you divorce that slave wife at some point, or if you choose not to honor her, she gets to go and be a free person. You do not get to mistreat even her. By the time of Jesus, Jesus is once again pushing his people forward into a new ethic that is better. Because Jesus calls his people to treat all people with righteousness, including both equal partners in this marriage. This is a huge leap forward in the dignity between men and women. May we always follow Jesus further and further into the way of righteousness. May our relationships be marked by righteousness. May our marriages be safe havens of peace, dignity, and love. That's the goal of Jesus. May it be true for our church. If we can pray for you or your family, if we can pray for your marriage, if we can offer you help, would you please let us know? Let's stand and sing together.